Good morning, everyone that's joining. Hope you're doing well. So, all right, I will get started and introduce myself to those who are here. Very much thank you for joining. My name is David Ortinau. I am a senior program manager at Microsoft working on mobile developer tools. And yes, I have lost my voice the last few days. So you get my best Barry White impression here, which is not very good. You can get me on Twitter and on Twitch and just about anywhere else using David Ortinau as my handle. And then my email address. So email me anytime. Questions about Xamarin.Forms, you're looking for something, you have issues, or if you want to share with us what you're working on, what your plans are coming up, or what you're shipping today. We very much want to know what that is and want to see the boots on the ground perspective, right, on what Xamarin.Forms is doing for you, and Xamarin as a whole. Xamarin.iOS, Xamarin.Android, Xamarin.Mac. We've got the components, we've got essentials, all that stuff kind of I'm interested in and working on. So please reach out anytime. Again, if you have any questions as I'm kicking along down the road here, post them in the chat. I'm happy to keep watching that and answer them as we go. I'll try to leave some time at the end for Q&A as well, to ask questions and provide deep insights, all my random thoughts as we go here. So we're going to talk about crafting consistent designs with Xamarin.Forms. And if you are here, then I expect that you are interested in doing that more easily, faster, because your own demand requires it, or because you've been asked to do it. Certainly is a trend that we've been seeing a lot when we talk to customers at a much larger number and scale. We find that 90% or even greater on a project here or there need their UI to be consistent. That means that it looks and behaves the same across Android and iOS. And I will be speaking specifically about Android and iOS in this presentation. Of course, it still may apply to desktop or tablet specific form factors, but I'm going to be focused on Android and iOS here. All right, so here's just, super simple example, right? Pull up any super popular app on your devices and compare them. In Instagram's case, I found it interesting that they were very similar, but not exactly the same. But this is still, the category of things that we're talking about here, where you want your experience to be consistent, you want the behaviors to be consistent, and then the question really becomes why? Why is this important? Why are customers asking for this? Why are companies demanding it? And we've talked to a few people about this, many people, and we hear things like this. Our customers are elderly, and when they call in for support, we want to know that our instructions are consistent no matter the device. They reported to us that, and then this is a healthcare customer, that when somebody calls in, the customer support person can't be like, okay, well, what device are you on? Is it iOS or Android? Is it Android version 5, 6? What are you on? That gets them nowhere, and it just confuses everybody. So having that consistent experience really helps their ability to provide quick support, accurate support. And then we hear this: by supporting one UI, we can move faster than our competition. The ability to get to market quickly is a huge value proposition for any cross-platform framework, right? And Xamarin and Xamarin.Forms are no exception. So this is a high priority, and by unifying the UI, making it easier to do, you spend less time moving from Android to iOS and back to Android and nudging things around, trying to make them as consistent as you can. And then another one is our company supports many apps, so sharing more code means less burden of support, right? So there's the whole maintenance aspect of things. Some of the customers that we speak with on a regular basis, they may have 30, 40 apps and hundreds of thousands of users. And anytime that they have to split things off and do things twice, it's just, clearly, you're here, you do this for a living. I expect that this resonates with you as well. I certainly know it does for me. And then this was an interesting one that came up with somebody that I spoke to recently. It's to get approved by a regulatory body like the FDA. So if you have apps that need to go through rigorous rules testing for security purposes or whatever, sometimes it's an additional hassle to have to get that approved twice and to have the level of consistency you need to get through that regulation process. So having the consistency really smooths that out. All right, so where do we begin? Well, this is what you would get today. It's what you have gotten since the beginning when you start a Xamarin.Forms app. You do a file new, and I added a few additional fields here to the About page and kind of goofed around with a few things, but I just threw some things on the screen that clearly show that on Android, you get something quite different than you get on iOS. For one thing, those fonts and colors are different, right? So there's that. That button, totally different. iOS has a very different perspective on how a button should look. And then the entry, of course. And there are many, many more controls, but these are some of the big ones that can throw a wrench into providing that consistency. And really, the only things that look anywhere similar are the logo and the background of that thing, of the box at the top, which is good. But then again, I wouldn't say that you have padding issues on this particular design. I mean, they're different devices, they're different sizes, so that image is going to scale slightly differently. You can do additional work to make that more uniform between different platforms, but naturally things are going to scale and size differently between devices, between DPIs, and all that. So how do you go about doing that? How do you go about making your app look the same? And so you see all these different methods on the screen here, and you're like, okay, well, I started by putting my control on the screen, right? And you probably can't see my cursor, but you start by putting your control on the screen, and then you start adding styles to it. And you style it, you open it up in iOS, and you look at that, and then you open it up on Android, and you're like, what? It's not the same. What's going on? And so then you're like, okay, you go to the documentation and you're looking for what you can do. You see this thing called effects. You see another thing called behaviors. You might happen upon platform specifics, and you're starting to wonder, which one do I use? What's going to get me what I need here? And you'll likely fall into the on-platform helper, which is very helpful. And so then you start using on-platform. You say, okay, well, on this platform, I want the color to be this, and on the other platform, it'll be that. I want the font size to be this. I want the background to be that, and you're doing it per platform. But that's still duplicated code, right? Even though it's inside one XAML file or one C# file. So then eventually you'll probably land in the custom renderers area, although you might take a journey through custom controls first and see if you can't build yourself a composite control that does what you want it to do. I was just looking at somebody's issue this morning where they're using the new image button control, and when it gets updated and the bindings fire, the image skews inside of it. And so, one of the workarounds is, well, go back and do what you would have done before you had an image button and build a composite control in XAML, put down a stack layout or a frame, and then style that and put your image in the middle of it and position it the way you want. And that's all very doable, and I think that a lot of people probably skip the custom controls. So I guess it's a much more valid and useful thing than some of these others that it's like, where do you go? This is confusing. The font choices here are confusing, right? Somebody's twitching right now at home watching this and looking at these different fonts like, oh, I can't stand it. Please move on to the next slide. And you may end up doing Skia, and there are definitely really, really good reasons to use Skia. It's very good at particular things. But you'll eventually end up in the custom renderers area where you are down in the platform control layers, and you're dealing with a UI button now instead of just a Xamarin.Forms button, and you're trying to figure out which properties to use, and maybe iOS wasn't what you signed up for in terms of the SDK you wanted to learn. Same thing with Android. So this is what brings us to visual. So I have a couple of images here on the screen. We've got a collapsing card view, right? And so I took some of these samples directly from Material.io, which is the Google Material Design Guide. And I reproduced them using our new material components. So what we're going to talk about today is how visual can help you to provide more consistency in your designs easily, right out of the box. So based on what you see here, all I've done is told this app to use material as the visual element or the visual design style, and it automatically themed all these different controls to be consistent with each other. So let's look a little bit more at what this is. So what is visual? So visual is at its most basic, it's a set of renderers. So you may be asking, well, why not just create styles to do this? Can you not unify all your existing renderers with styles? And maybe I'll even back up one step more in terms of the architecture of how Xamarin.Forms works. So at the Xamarin.Forms level, we have controls, right? You've got stack layout, and all the layouts really are managed in the forms layer. But then you get into the actual controls like your buttons, your editors, your entries, pickers, labels, progress, all the things that are on the screen here, plus more. And what happens is when Xamarin.Forms asks for a renderer, it uses the control and then it goes to the platform. And the platform has at that point already registered what native control to use when you ask for that thing. So when you ask for a button in Xamarin.Forms, the UI button is the registered renderer for that button. So when you run it on iOS, you get a UI button. We don't create that. We definitely work on styling it and making it easier to work with. But it's definitely an iOS control. Same thing on Android, you get a button. So we can style it to a certain point, and that's probably what you have been spending a lot of your time doing, is trying to style things to get the level of consistency you want, or just to achieve the style you want. But when it comes to really unifying things, you end up in the custom renderer territory because you need a much deeper level of platform-specific control. And those are not necessarily properties that make sense to put in the forms layer because it may be very specific to Android and not to iOS or vice versa. So this is how we end up at creating a whole new set of custom renderers. And so what Visual does, Visual is not the renderer itself. Visual is just an API that allows us to group together a bunch of renderers that can provide that consistent, specific design system. And so we went and looked at what we could do most quickly based on the kinds of designs that we see that you've been making. And material design seemed like the much closer starting point at this point in time. But of course, we know that it can and should expand to other design systems, perhaps even your own corporate or company design. If you have a designer, you have a design team, you have, Microsoft, of course, we have this, which is why we've come up with Fluent and Fabric, and we continue to evolve both of those. We can build out a design system set of renderers and then implement them very easily using Visual, and I'll show you how that happens here. But as we looked at what was available today, we found that Google has a set of iOS controls for material design. And so we said, well, let's validate this as quickly as we can with customers. Let's get this into their hands and find out if this really is going to meet some needs. So here's a list of the controls that are provided for iOS. And of course, you get these already on Android because it's part of Android, the material design control theming. And so you have the activity indicator, button, editor, entry frame, and we'll look at these examples in a demo app that I have here. Actually, why don't I go ahead and pop over to the demo app? Because I've got my emulators here, and we'll go ahead and go back to the app that was running. And where's my iOS? Here's my iOS. All right. So we'll start with activity indicator. And this is a project that is available up on GitHub. I'll click over to the browser here in a second and show it to you. Actually, why don't I? Because if I don't do it now, I will completely forget. We'll copy this, and hopefully I can paste into the chat. So if you're looking at the chat, you can go grab this code and play with it. I have not updated this to the latest release of Xamarin.Forms, so it may be a touch behind, but this is very close to what we shipped with Xamarin.Forms 3.6. So this has been in preview for a few versions, but now it's baked in terms of you don't need the experimental flag at the beginning. So I'll show you how you can enable this as well. So yeah, you see how those activity indicators are super consistent. And if we come over here to button, right, very consistent. Yeah, and this is actually a little bit outdated because I replaced that bank icon with the Xamagon. Got to get the Xamagon into all the designs, you know. The card view or the frame is definitely one that people are really excited about. That's a much nicer looking shadow, especially on iOS, than what you get right now with a frame. And a lot of consistency here. But then the next question becomes, well, how do I control that consistency? And we'll get to look at that here in just a second. So let's see here. I think I had one more slide, two more slides, and then we'll go over to some code. All right, so here on this screen, it's just another example of something I pulled a template from the design gallery on material.io, because again, we're shooting for that design system. And it's important to remember that when you are dealing with design systems, they are quite opinionated. So they have rules. They want the padding to be a certain way. They want the spacing to be a certain way. So like the entry field, for example, right now, it's very specifically the size and dimensions that the material design system declares it should be. And so we'll be exposing more properties in the future that will allow you to override that, but you get a very specific rule set, essentially. So that's something to be aware of here. Yeah, so you can see that I'm just using buttons. I'm using box views. Well, box view isn't one, but whoa, what did I do? I hit the scroll bar. There we go. So, you know, these are not different controls here in my XAML. These are the controls that you already use. And so how is this working? How is it that suddenly we have a whole new renderer working here? So here's the renderer process. When forms init is called, Forms is going to register button renderers by type and by visual marker. What you've seen previously was it was just by type. But now we have a visual marker. So you could conceivably have multiple visual design dependencies within your project, and you can mix and match them, and you can also specify a fallback, an order of usage. So in this case, it's going to look at our dependencies, and it's going to see that we have a material registered button in addition to the Xamarin.Forms default button. Now, when that new content page is loaded up and called, the app parses that UI, and it's going to ask for a button. That button, as I mentioned previously, is going to look up that renderer by type and visual. And if it doesn't find anything, it will fall back, of course, to the default renderer. It will create a detached instance of everything, populate all the properties, and then it will send it to the screen and inflate it. So that's really the renderer process, where it crosses over from the forms shared code into your platform specific code, or into the platform specific code. And you can, of course, when you are creating your own custom renderers, you're just hooking in at that platform level. So let's go to code. So when you want to get up and running with visual, let's make this a little bit bigger, and so can I? Yeah, that didn't work. I tried to zoom in on my screen, but it didn't zoom for you, so we're not going to do that. But over here, I might be able to make that a little bigger. There we go. So the first thing that you do to get going with visual and material, visual, like I said, is just an API, so it's available out of the box with Xamarin.Forms. There's nothing additional you need to add there. But in order to get those renderers that we're talking about, the material bits, you need to install this visual material package. when we spoke to developers, library developers, customers like yourself, and asked, do you want us to bundle all of this stuff inside of Xamarin.Forms, or do you want to very clearly see that you've taken this dependency? It was 100% people asking to see this. So it does mean that you need to go add the package, but it is a package that we support, of course. And that concludes all those renderers that we've been talking about. You're going to do this both for Android and for iOS. Now, on the Android side, I think there's a little bit of code in there, but of course the renderers themselves are part of Android. So there's not a lot otherwise happening there. And then in your app delegate, you're going to come over here and you're going to initialize it as down here. So then once you've got that initialized, and you can see here also that I've got those flags, the experimental flags that I mentioned before. Come on, close solution, close. There we go. You see this line here. We used to have visual in here. You don't need that anymore as of 3.6. So it's in here because this is a slightly older, I'm behind master, but you don't need that anymore. So you just need to call this guy, and then you can go back up to your shared code and you're ready to just get started. There's no additional dependency that you need to add to the shared project or the .NET Standard project. And when I say shared project, I mean the library. I'm not specifically speaking about shared project types. Probably shouldn't use those. All right, so I do have it here, but you don't actually need it. I don't know why it's there. So in this particular project, I am using Shell, which is a new basically navigation type and container for your application. So when you get started with Shell, it creates your flyouts, your tabs, and it creates a whole new URI-based navigation service for you. It's really, really cool, but it's not the point of this conversation. But I just wanted to reference it in terms of it is basically running the show here for us. You can think of it as taking tab page and master detail page and turning it into a super control with a lot more flexibility and a lot more functionality too. So that's what's going on here. We started our app shell. If we look in our app shell file, you can see that up here I have declared visual equals material. So that is going to then cascade and seep into every page, every control, and it's going to ask them to all use material when they're going to render. So very, very easy to get started with this because I've done it at the shell level. Now you can also do this at the page level. So I could come in here to my buttons page and I could say, hey, I also want you to use material. I mean, I wouldn't. Obviously, this is useless since I already did it at the content page or at the shell level. But what I could do is I could override it. And I can say, you know what, default. I don't want this page to use the material stuff. I just want to use what Xamarin.Forms gives me out of the box. I'm good with that. You can also do it side by side down here at the control level. I could do it at stack layout and say, okay, just what's inside of here, use this visual. And again, it will seep into, that's my new phrase, seep into. Just came up with it today. Somebody's gonna yell at me about it. You can do it there and it will update both renders, or of course you can do it here on each render. So a lot of flexibility in terms of how you wanna use it. You can just let it run the show from everywhere, or you can go down into each control and say, okay, I just really want this button to use that material because I like, I like the shadow, I like whatever about it. And of course, you also get, you may have seen this in the GIF that I ran earlier, and I can actually flip back over here. Of course, when I click on the More button here, you see I get my ripple. But what about iOS? Oh, look at that. You get some ripple. Hopefully that's come across on the web stream there. Yeah, so very cool. So yeah, you get the ripple effect, which is really nice, and obviously kind of just tells everybody this is material. Let's see, what else can I mention about this? So the other thing that you can do in the future, so if you go about packaging and creating your own material renderers, which I'll dive into kind of some of the architecture here in just a sec, you could actually do that here as well. So you could say, okay, I want material if first you should look for custom. And you could, I mean, your custom material could be Fred for all that matters. It's just a marker that you indicate what you want it to be called, and that what you have specified when you registered your renderers. And then Visual will then use that when it goes to do the lookup for the renderers. All right, let's see. So we talked about that. We've got all the different renderers. So this is a great project for you to reference. I'll make sure that I get it updated with all the latest Xamarin.Forms versions and everything. But very easy to look at, to get going with. The entries are very, very popular, but more work needs to happen there. And I'll talk a bit more about kind of what we're learning as we've gotten this out. We definitely are in the mode of ship quickly, work from priorities, ship quickly to those priorities, and iterate. So we're learning and we're listening. So that also means that we really depend on you to reach out to us and let us know the impact of what we're doing and what we can do to help. Yeah, if we look at this entry here, you definitely get the animations as you would expect. You can see that you can set color for the bottom stroke, the text itself, and the placeholder. But what is not yet available, and you can tweak the background, but what is not yet available is to have real full control of all of those elements, because they're not all yet completely exposed. They're slightly different, I guess, than the properties that we have. So we have a pull request, or I'm sorry, an issue, a spec right here, to add properties for material specific attributes. So it's issue 5005. So go take a look at this and share your thoughts. I'm gonna drop this in the chat. I'm assuming you can see my chat, right? Take a look at that, comment on it, let us know what you think. Even if your comment is just a thumbs up or a thumbs down, because those things do matter, they help us. Right now we got 4 hearts, but there are way more than 4 of you. So please come comment on that. Essentially what we would do then is for styling options that are very specific to those controls, we would expose them in some way like this. We've got options. And that is something that is very, very close to being next on our list of things to do. The reason that it becomes important in particular for something like button, where you have multiple styles of material buttons, like outline. If you go look at the material.io documentation, look at all these different types of buttons, right? Whereas in Xamarin.Forms, until recently, all you had was button. Now you have image button. And of course, you can add a tap gesture recognizer or anything, but we're talking specifically about material. So we want to make sure that we expose all of those as separate renderers, or at least a family of renderers, and make it easy for you to choose when you want the outline, when you want the, whatever that one's called, text button. There it is. Hey, I can read. All right. So I will mention also that we did the reason that we realized pretty quickly, like day one, when we started putting this into everybody's hands, when I myself started creating visual challenges, is that we really needed to expose a lot more of this stuff to make these things super useful. We had the choice when we started to decide, do we ship more controls or do we ship one control with a ton of properties? And I'm glad we ship more controls, because now we kind of know which controls get more usage. So I'm looking at the visual challenge repository here. If you follow me, if you read our blog, then you've seen that we did recently this visual challenge, which was hugely successful. Very excited about it. We have, 53 pull requests now. You can still go up and do this. All you do is clone the repository, go try to reproduce one screen from any app. It's already got the Xamarin.Forms versions and visual packages baked into it. So you just need to pull it and start working with it. And so this is an example of what Ryan was able to do, Ryan Davis from Australia. Beautiful travel app, flight app for, what is it, Australian Air or something like this? Where is it? Qantas, the Qantas app. So that corner, everybody asks about the corner, the upper corner. It's an image in the layout, just sitting up there. And then you got the tabs at the bottom. beautiful stuff, really nice. So the card view, the frame ends up being, you can see my cursor, can't you? My finger's pointing. You can see the frame there with the nice drop shadow, and look how nice and consistent it looks. The one on the left, the far left here, is the source image, and then of course you have iOS and Android here, which are the versions he created. Still some consistency we need to bring to label colors and things like that. Some of those were just inherited from the theme. If you go ahead and just override, set the color specifically, you should get consistent colors everywhere. But through this challenge, we asked what went well, which is great, what went less well, or what didn't go well, and then we asked, what you wanted to see next. And so all this feedback, we got this from 50 plus of you. A few of you actually live streamed your exercises on this, which is fantastic. I cannot tell you how interesting and useful that is. It's amazing. And then I met so many people that we'd never spoken to before. So if you want to know about this a little bit more, it's related to obviously what we're learning, what we're doing here, how we're learning how to improve these controls for your usage. You get material design controls. So it's the blog here. And I just keep putting these in the chat because that seems like the right thing to do. So go check that out, and you can see a picture here. And actually, I think I have a slide that kind of goes over this. Some really nice looking advanced stuff. And whether somebody spent an hour on it, or in my case, I probably spent like a day on at least one of these. You can create some really great stuff in short time. And we heard a lot of comments like, this would have taken me 40 hours and I was able to knock it out in 90 minutes. Or I only built this for Android, and I clicked over to iOS and it looked just like I wanted it to, that kind of stuff, which is really pleasing for us to hear, because in the past, without this capability, you would have to do a lot of back and forth and on platforms and all those things that are very useful that I showed at the beginning. But if you don't have to do them, you don't want to do them. Right. How are we doing on time? We are all right. We're doing well. So let's talk a little bit about what happens here in the code and how you could utilize this to do a custom render. And actually, because I have the code here, I actually have an example. So you saw here custom renderees. So on Android, we have this, I'm a custom visual renderer. And on iOS, it's actually blank, which was the starting screen I had. That's because it's not implemented over here yet. But this is a custom visual renderer. So let's look at what that is. All right, so we are in visual testing, custom renderers. So you see that it's a button, and it's visual equals custom. And of course, in iOS, I have nothing. So in this case, it should fall back to the original button. Oh, you know why? Because there's no text. Where's the text coming from? Oh, that's funny. Oh, I know where the text is coming from. It's coming from the renderer itself. Matthew Leibowitz did this. And so on Android, let me fix my screen here a little bit. How is my, so I got a preview. Cool. So you see here at the top, we have the assembly tag, and we're going to export this renderer. The type is, of course, button. And in the implementation here, we're actually using the material button renderer as our base. You don't have to. You use whatever you want to as your base because it's your custom renderer. But in this case, he chose to start from the material button. And then he sets his own type, and he is using custom visual. So where is custom visual coming from? If we come look over here, it's just a class that implements, or the interface iVisual, which has no actual implementation. It just exists as a marker to use when asking for that visual. So in my case, or in Fred's case, Fred, tell your wife you're famous. I chose Fred before I even saw there was a Fred in the chat. That's awesome. I think it's awesome. So you could do this, right? And then in my code, back up here, nope, not there. Here, this is where I would put Fred, just like that. all there is to it. And in this particular case, because this is all part of the same project, I don't have another NuGet package. I don't need to do the initialization in the app delegate or the main activity. Of course, reason being, it is part of the same project. The linker will not go stripping that thing out, or it ought not to, because it's all part of the same project. All right. So, I mean, that's really the magic of the connection right there, is in the renderer, making sure you get these things set up. And notice this is an array. So if you want this particular renderer to be utilized across multiple visual implementations, you can do that. So a lot of flexibility for you here in terms of how you do this. All right, let's flip back. A lot of flipping. Sorry for the flipping. So that's what this is describing. I know I'm not full screen. Let's go ahead and go full screen. Yep, so I show an iOS example, very similar. And then, yeah, as mentioned, you do, yeah. So this is if you want it to be fully linker safe. You want to go register things. All right, so I mentioned the visual challenge here. You can still participate. We got a lot of activity from it. Very interesting stuff there. A lot of screenshots. And I actually noticed that some people, when they were going to explore visual and try out the challenge, they referenced other people's pull requests. And, it's all open source. It's all MIT. So you can go check it out and see what you like, and, maybe even find some tips and tricks from other people in terms of how they did things. Now, this was a visual challenge. I had somebody ask, hey, how come the scrolling is not as smooth as I would like it to be in somebody else's pull request? And that wasn't really the point of the challenge. It wasn't to optimize and AOT everything. So keep that in mind. So a few statistics here for you. In 9 days, we had 40 participants. So very short period of time, tons of feedback plus code repros, 115 forks at the time that I counted. There might be more now. I know there's 53 pull requests now. Two meetups hosted and talked through these. And then, as I mentioned, 2 live streams, tons of wonderful content out there. Twitch is becoming a thing. I would love to know if you're twitching, which I guess is not really a verb, I was told by my children. But if you're streaming on Twitch and you're streaming anything related to Xamarin, I would very much like to know that and support you. We are talking about doing some featuring of streams. And so talk to me about that. All right, so what is next? So Shell is the primary focus right now as we approach 4.0. And we'll be looking at how we can better support visual within Shell, because they kind of complement each other really, really well. Shell provides a little bit of consistency, or actually a lot of consistency, in terms of navigation itself, tab bars, flyouts, top tabs, things like that. But we can use visual to further unify that. So I'm looking forward to being able to say shell visual equals material and have it not just be those controls that we've looked at so far, but have it be the navigation bar, the tab bar, and a lot of those things that are, in my opinion, way too hard to customize because they're very native, specific, and they're not basic controls. They're not primitives. They are complex. So I've even thrown out the idea of why don't we introduce a forms navigation bar, and it's just forms and there's no native in there whatsoever. Well, no native navigation bar. I don't know that that's gotten any traction yet, but I'm out here stumping for it apparently, seeing if I can get some votes. And as I mentioned, we showed you the the issue there for exposing more control, more properties on those material controls, and that will be coming soon. I will make sure that I provide links to all of these things so that I believe there's a blog post that will come with like a summary as well, and we'll make sure that that's all included so that you can easily link out to all these GitHub repos and blog posts that I referenced. There's also documentation. I'll provide easy links to the docs for some of these preview features. As I mentioned, my Twitter, my Twitch, my email, reach out at any time. I look forward to meeting you, talking to you. If you're ever up at Build or in Seattle when I'm up there, let me know. Let's go get coffee. All right. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it. I will see you on the interwebs.